Good evening to the physical audience here in Glasgow University and to our live virtual audience as well. My name's Campbell Forrest and I'm a member of the Society's Council and I'm your chair for this evening. A personal comment, I'm very grateful to those of you who have turned out this evening, and I look forward personally hugely to a future when the harm of the virus is diminished and we can all enjoy the health benefits of proper social interaction, because they are real and we're not getting enough of it just now. That's my personal comment. The talk this evening will last about 46 minutes. We'll then have a short break of 5 minutes or so and follow that with a question session. For those of you on Zoom, if questions occur to you during the talk, you can post these into the Q&A on Zoom. Please keep the questions relevant to the subject of the talk. This evening, the Society's AGM will follow the Q&A session, and we expect it, as normal, to be very short. Very quickly, I'd like to give a plug also this evening to a special event in this year's programme, which takes place a week today. And it's the British Academy Joint Lecture. And it will be given not in this lecture theatre, but in the Sir Charles Wilson building, which is at the opposite end of University Avenue, at the bottom of the hill. The full details of that lecture are available on the website. So now it's my great pleasure to welcome our speaker this evening, Professor Lorne Crerar. Professor Crerar, in the old phrase, is for sure a man of parts. Born in Renfrewshire, schooled in Glasgow, and gaining his law degree at Glasgow University, he also found time to be selected for the Scotland Rugby under-21 squad, till that was curtailed by injury. But instead of abandoning the sport, he qualified as a referee and officiated at high levels. His law career took an entrepreneurial turn when, at a fairly early age, he left the relative security of partnership to found a new company, now the highly successful Harper Macleod. He somehow also found time to teach as Professor of Banking at this university and to write the standard text on the subject. Amongst far too many numerous civic duties to mention just now, he has served as Deputy Chairman of Scottish Enterprise Glasgow, convener of the Standards Commission for Scotland, it's on ethics, and he chaired in the early 2000s what is now known as the Crerar Review into the regulation of the public sector. He also, in the 2019 Scottish Legal Awards, received from his peers the Lifetime Achievement Award. Meantime, the rugby interest continued and he served on and chaired discipline boards at Six Nations, European and World Cup levels. We'd love to hear tales of the dirty deeds, but I think they'd surely be banned from our ears this evening, Lorne, unfortunately. And finally, and most relevant to tonight's talk, Lorne's intense love of the Highlands culminated in his serving on the board of Highlands and Islands Enterprise, followed by 2 terms as chairman, ending early in 2020. No one can be better placed to convince us how Scotland can prosper after the pandemic. The proof is in the Highlands. Professor Crerar.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and many thanks, Cam, for your kind and warm introduction. I was, of course, very flattered to be asked to provide this lecture tonight and was told I could address you on really whatever topic I wanted to, but most importantly, that you might find interesting. As Cam said, I'm very fortunate, I believe, to have a very varied career and reflected on some of the roles that I've held and what consequent experiences and insights might be most interesting and relevant to you this evening. Cam's mentioned I was the first convener of the Standards Commission for Scotland, and I could have addressed you upon the challenges of creation of such a new corporate body, the importance of the Nolan principles, with the consequent expected behaviours of elected officials or our representatives in public life, with the obvious relevance today to Partygate, or perhaps the background and challenges to the proposals I was asked to make to Scottish Government for the reform of the buying and selling process of residential property in Scotland, which resulted in the introduction of the current Home Report single survey system. And for any lawyers in the audience or online, you may recall it made me so unpopular in my own profession. Or perhaps most obviously for me, the challenges and lessons learned from building from scratch what is now one of Scotland's biggest and most prominent law firms. Or finally, maybe my most recent and current project and the challenges as being independent chair of the reform and governance of the ownership of Scottish Rugby and why it's an important project for Scotland. Now, interesting, all these projects, subject matter topics might be, and I'm happy to answer any questions about them later, but I mention them principally to reinforce the importance I place upon the topic I have chosen to discuss with you tonight. And I very much hope that you will not just find what I have to say interesting, but it might inform your thoughts and provide an insight into the potential future well-being and economic prosperity for Scotland. Sorry, the slides aren't moving, so just... Okay, thank you. So this slide is the essence of my argument, and the supporting evidence for my proposition begins with the establishment of the Highlands and Islands Development Board in 1965, which was at the time a unique experiment with the purpose of trying to improve the economic and social conditions for the people of the Highlands and Islands. It was a declared attempt to resolve what was called the Highland Problem, which was evidenced by a very significant depopulation and emigration from the Highlands. No one described, nor indeed fully understood, what were the root causes of the Highland Problem, but it was thought a significant factor was the limitation of good and varied employment opportunities, as the then economy of the Highlands and Islands was dominated by three sectors, namely crofting, forestry, and fishing. So I'd like to discuss with you the outcomes of that experiment, the operating model, the strategy, and the works of Highlands and Islands Development Board's successor body, Highlands and Islands Enterprise, which I will call HI from here on in, and how understanding these factors should go some way to inform us post-pandemic of the right course of planning for future economic and community development in Scotland. I will also try and briefly explain the linkage in such planning to land ownership reform and the importance of community land ownership initiatives, particularly in my region of the Highlands and Islands. I hope too that in providing my explanations, you will sense my passion for the opportunities, not just for the Highlands and Islands, but the whole of Scotland's rural and urban economies. They say home is where the heart is, which makes mine Gairloch Wester Ross. My family has been connected and involved in Gairloch for generations, and we were locked down there in our house during COVID for 16 months, working remotely from my day-to-day business. Pretty perfect, it seemed to me. I was a board member of Highlands and Islands Enterprise for 5 years, and thereafter chair for a further 8 years until the expiry of my term, as Cam has mentioned, in 2020. Being chair was an enormously challenging role, but much more importantly, a huge privilege. It was unquestionably a role I loved, enjoyed meeting businesses and communities across the region, and evidencing firsthand the real difference a well-functioning and focused economic development agency can make for the benefit of the well-being of the people, the businesses and communities it was established to serve. Highlands and Islands Enterprise had its 50th anniversary during my term of office, and a short 4-minute video of its journey was made. I would like to share this video with you, which I hope might be a helpful background to my talk. So, what is the extent of the geography of my region, the Highlands and Islands? Well, it is actually more than 50% of Scotland's landmass, and it covers from Shetland in the north to Mull of Kintyre in the south, all of our islands, and as you can see, a diagonal line up to the edge of Murrayshire. So, what is the declared objective and vision of the Highlands and Islands? Well, perhaps predictably, it's to make the region a very successful, inclusive and prosperous region in which increasing numbers of people choose to live, to work, to study and invest. And importantly, High has regional offices supporting businesses and communities in different geographies and the economies of the Highlands and Islands. As is obvious, the economy of Murray is very different from that of Shetland, and both are very different from the economy of Argyll and Bute. This model has, in my view, the very significant benefit of integrating the individual area offices into the local communities they serve, with the consequent distinctive knowledge of local needs and opportunities. So often I heard the word privilege used by colleagues across the whole region, reflecting their individual commitment and engagement, as well as personal fulfillment in helping their local businesses and communities grow and thrive. High is absolutely embedded in the culture of the whole region, and so it should be after 57 years passed since its creation, a critical factor to the impact on the economy as a whole. The headquarters of High is situated in the new Inverness campus. You will see it on the east side of the A9. The campus has been one of High's biggest and a very successful project. High is located appropriately among some of the businesses it has helped bring to life and supported to grow. I always enjoyed telling the story of High and how it used to be a tenant in one of the biggest office complexes in Inverness, but moved out to uncomfortable, drafty, temporary accommodation, and we had no formed next term location plans. High moved out because the other major tenant in our building, Capgemini, needed our space to grow and employ significantly more employees, or they would have to look at relocating, maybe out with the region. Without demur, not a difficult decision for High, an economic development agency, we moved out as quickly as we could. The final, and in my view, important piece of the organizational structure is the board of High. No board members are appointees of local government or other government agencies. They are selected through a Scottish Government public appointments process and ultimately appointed by Scottish Government ministers. They are skilled-based appointments underpinned by an interest and commitment to the region. How the board functions and operates is critical to the performance of High, and it is responsible for the creation and delivery of the organisation's strategy. The strategy is approved by Scottish Government to be in line with and contribute to Scotland's economic plan. Key performance indicators are agreed with them and include, for example, the number of jobs we created and supported, the increase in business turnover, increase in international sales, the average wage of jobs supported, and the number of jobs supported in fragile and remote areas. In moments of crisis, some of which I will mention later, the board must be able to shoulder the burden as a unified, collective voice of the organisation. When I took over as chair, it was with the challenge of an unhappy board. They felt, as some other public agencies boards did and do, that they were but a necessary irritant for good governance compliance, adding very little to outcomes, as well as feeling unconnected to the communities and businesses the organisation served. The board dynamic changed. No longer was there frustration and interference with the professional executives, but the board members now took on a role of constructive, informed and friendly challenge. The board no longer just met in Inverness, but held board meetings across the region, engaging with our stakeholders and organised events both before and after board meetings. The board visited enterprises and communities, which informed decisions of choice as to what sectors or businesses and communities to support. I'm very pleased to say that over time, the organisation of High and its performance measured against the KPIs I've mentioned was held up by Scottish Government and its ministers as being the jewel in the crown. This is important when I come to later to the challenges of the Scottish Government Enterprise and Skills Review and its outcomes in relation to the important opportunities of economic planning for Scotland in the future. A key factor of performance for High must be how well you work with your local authorities. We have 6, and other Scottish Government agencies to produce the best results for the region. I have always expressed the view that collaboration should be much, much better across the public sector. In High, it is a fundamental value, tested by feedback from customers and partners, that we're an easy organisation to work with and will deliver what we promise. However, it's fair to say that our relationship with our larger fellow economic development agency, Scottish Enterprise, was uncomfortable and strained. It shouldn't have been, and more of that issue later. We are very fortunate in our region to have the long-standing Convention of the Highlands and Islands, which involves all the local authorities of the region and relevant Scottish Government agencies that come together twice a year under the chair of the Deputy First Minister to action solutions for accepted problems of the region. These problems do not leave the agenda until over time they are resolved. For example, broadband connectivity, mobile telecoms connectivity, particularly the A9, governance issues for the University of the Highlands and Islands. It works and should be an example to be adopted elsewhere in other regions of Scotland. So what does High actually do, and how much is its annual funding? Well, High's efforts in supporting businesses to grow, to develop and export goods and services takes many forms, including the provision of advice, training, funding, organising events, or the provision of property from which to work. It has a similar toolkit of services and support for communities and social enterprise. The budget allocated by Scottish Government to High for financial year 21-22 was 67 million, and the indicative budget for 22-23 is 64 million. Perhaps the most illustrative way of giving you an insight into the variety of support that High provides is for me to take you upon a brief tour around the region, mentioning businesses and communities where each intervention by High has made the important difference as to whether or not a project proceeds or succeeds. My tour for you is from memory, having visited each project, and hopefully we'll recognise some of them and enjoy the story. So I will start in the capital of the Highlands and Islands, Inverness, and at the major infrastructure investment of Inverness campus, which I've already mentioned. Fully occupied phase 1 is mostly a life sciences hub, a skill base that has grown and developed since Inverness Medical, now Johnson & Johnson, arrived in Inverness in 1995, following a successful tender against other well-placed international locations. It's now the biggest life sciences company in Scotland and employs over 1,100 people in Inverness. Now onto the banks of the Ness, to the HQ of the University in the Highlands and Islands, which began as a concept of High, researched and developed over time. The key moment was 2011, when the University of the Highlands and Islands achieved degree awarding university status. It now has over 40,000 students, 75% of which are from the Highlands and Islands, with a further 18% from the rest of Scotland. The hoped for economic development opportunities of having a university based and headquartered in the region are now coming to life. Turning east towards Elgin, we pass Norbord, Scotland's biggest producer of chipboard, a facility opened by the First Minister, onto our account managed businesses, Baxter's and Walker Shortbread, passing our investment in business incubator facilities at the new Murray College, University of the Highlands and Islands. See our support for Glasgow School of Arts Highland facilities High's Forest Business Park, extended many times, with one of its most recent tenants being Orbex Satellites, the proposed principal operator for Mellness Space Centre, Sutherland. Now we go back to Inverness, passing the opportunities of the new Ardeshir harbour site and development. Heading north on the A9, we pass the port of Cromarty Firth at Invergordon, our new quayside, where this year, post-pandemic, 115 vessels and 200,000 tourists will disembark. On the other side of the Cromarty Firth, we can see the headquarters of Highland-based Global Energy and the Nig Yard, one of High's biggest investments, from derelict site to Highland's largest private sector employer, delivering on manufacturing and embarkation of green energy projects, as well as decommissioning. On we go north through our industrial units of Eventon, then on to evidence the infrastructure renovation and community developments in Dornoch. Passing through Helmsdale, we see our support for much needed community housing. Arriving at Wick, we see the works at Wick Harbour, enabling over 100 new jobs for offshore maintenance of the Bowl and Beatrice wind farms. We pass kitchen manufacturers Ashley Ann and its new production line. We also see the critical support for the Pulteney Town People's Project, then up to Thurso and the Green Energy Apprenticeship Scheme we created at the University of the Highlands and Islands North Highland. A quick detour to see the support for the John O'Groats leisure development as a tourism destination. Back to see our significant contribution to Scrabster Harbour, and look out to Atlantic Magen's Pentland Firth tidal stream turbine project, the first and largest of its kind in the world. We go and meet on the outskirts of Thurso, yes, Thurso, AMTE Power, the UK's second largest producer of energy cells, that is pressing ahead with the building of a new UK gigafactory. Next door, we meet another Thurso-founded innovative business, Denshi Group, that specialises in batteries, chargers, and power solutions for the defence industry. Now we take the ferry to Orkney and the European Marine Energy Centre, established with our support in 2003, the world's first and now leading facility for testing wave and tidal convectors, the technologies that generate electricity by harnessing the power of wave and tidal streams. We look at the pioneering green hydrogen economy for Orkney and its hydrogen plant before looking around the new 4-acre Orkney Research and Innovation Campus, built to capitalise upon the island's green energy research and a joint venture between Orkney Island Council and High. I want to take a breath and tell you about the fascinating story of Wave Energy Scotland. It's a company you're unlikely to have heard of, but was formed in 2014 at the request of Scottish Government, and it's a subsidiary of High. Why High? Well, it's the main centre for Scottish Government's knowledge in the marine energy sector. The aim of Wave Energy Scotland is to ensure that Scotland maintains a leading role in the development of marine energy, and in particular, wave energy. The remaining holy grail in marine energy is solving the technology for harnessing the power of wave. Remember, half of Europe's wave energy is in the UK, and 61% of UK's coastline is in the Highlands and Islands. With Scottish Government's extra funding, we've committed £43 million involving 260 organisations across 13 countries. Prototypes of the final technology solutions are currently and will be tested at EMEC. The conquering of the technology problem for the harnessing of wave energy is tantalizingly close. I believe very soon we will be hearing much more about this unique national project. Wave Energy Scotland's expertise has been recognised internationally and acknowledged with a recent strategic EU partnership, which created a further €20 million of funding to finally solve and finish the wave energy journey. Our favourite beach is in Gairloch and is imaginatively called Big Sand. You may know it. We love going down to the beach in cold, bad weather It's magnificent. And so in the pouring West Coast rain, we know that all around us, hydro schemes are developing energy from its falling. Facing into a force 7 gale, we can see the inner sound between the islands of Rona, Rassi, and the mainland. A reminder of the first community wind turbine development in Fair Isle. Onshore and offshore wind are just routinely now capable of being captured for energy. On a spring tide in Gairloch, it is 5.5 meters from low to high tide. And in the Pentland Firth, Atlantic Maygem have pioneered the way to harnessing its force. After all, 25% of Europe's potential tidal stream is in Scotland. And with the waves created by the winds and tide, the final piece of the jigsaw is almost resolved. What an opportunity for the region and Scotland. So I'm resuming our journey up to Ortac Jewellery and Kirkwall, the handcraft capital of the UK, and the Orkney Gin Distillery, a favourite. Flight to one of my favourite places, Fair Isle, and the first ever community wind farm development, and our support for birdwatching tourism. Now to Shetland and see the works and support for decommissioning of Lerwick Port Authority, support for businesses in Black Hand Engineering, award-winning social enterprise Cope, and my favourite community startup business in Unst, Polycrub, harnessing knowledge from an austere and windy environment to make award-winning polytunnels, now employing full-time and exporting as far away as the Falkland Islands. The last stop, specialist boat builders Flodda Boats, and then back to the mainland. Back on Pentland Firth, we pass decommissioning at Dounreay, the Space Centre at Melness, and much needed high quality jobs. I want to pause my journey again and talk to you about the background to the UK's first space centre. The Highlands and Islands is the best placed location in Europe from which to launch small satellites into polar sun synchronous low Earth orbits. Such orbits are particularly important for scientists for various reasons, including monitoring climate change and rising sea levels. The Sutherland and Melness project was, unusually for High, a project undertaken at its own hands, rather than the norm of supporting others to procure the project. Why? Well, there was a very significant investment risk in procuring such a project. We didn't think anyone else would do it. But we considered, as did Scottish Government, that this was an opportunity that could not be missed. It was far too important for the region and Scotland, as well as the communities close to the decommissioning of Dounreay, with the pressing need for new, well-paid, high-quality jobs. The spaceport will employ 40 people and 400 supply chain jobs. I've already mentioned Orbex, the satellite builder and contractor, now based in Murray and part of the supply chain. High will invest 17 million with an additional 2.5 million from the UK Space Agency. It was an enormously difficult project to bring to a conclusion. The Space Centre will be located on the Moyne Peninsula on the Pentland Firth. The Moyne, you may know, is one of the most heavily designated areas in the UK because of its rare and threatened wildlife and plant species. Be assured that all the necessary actions to protect and sustain all these important species are in place with the agreement and support of environment and natural habitat agencies. After long and detailed consultation with the local communities, they were fully supportive, and their insights and requirements fundamental to concluding the plans for the Space Centre. It was a huge relief to High and our community stakeholders when planning consent was granted by the Highland Council. Of course, there had been voices of objection, but a small minority, and everything was done to allay their fears and concerns. Once planning consent had been obtained, a new, unexpected, and final hurdle to the project emerged. a legal challenge by Anders Poulsen, Scotland's largest landowner and Danish billionaire, who owns some land nearby. It was an action raised in Scotland's most senior civil court and sought to challenge the planning decision of the Highland Council. The action was dismissed as being without merit. Scotland has secured the first mainland spaceport of the UK with all the consequent opportunities that holds. So, resuming our journey, won't take too much longer. On to Durness and office incubators, south to community support in Kinloch-Bervie for motorhome sites as a result of North Coast 500. See the new pontoons at Lochinver and the Highland stoneware manufacturing plant and the first community land buyout at Assynt, down to Ullapool, its new business park, and other support for Ullapool Port Trust. Over the sea to Lewis, and our first site is the Arnish Stornoway manufacturing site and its troubled history. We see our ongoing 25 million investment in Stornoway Harbour for leisure and cruise, the rebuild and refurbishment of Lewes Castle, the renaissance of Harris Tweed to a worldwide brand. Visit the inspiring Galston Community Trust and now owner of a northern part of Lewis. BASF, the international pharmaceutical business in West Lewis, Callanish, employing almost 100 people, including highly qualified scientists and researchers, some of whom have returned home to their island, never expecting their high-level qualifications to have opened opportunities for their living destination of choice, home in Lewis. Down to Harris and the transformation of Tarbert, how we helped bring to life Harris Gin, and now one of Harris's biggest employers. Beautiful Luscantire and Tallanamara, the community and housing development, next to Leverburgh and our support for St Kilda boats. Ferry to North Uist and one of UK's biggest seaweed processing plants, our 15 million investment in Loch Boisdale Harbour, pontoons in Lochmaddy, last in the chain Barra, a new oyster farm and marine facilities in Castle Bay. Ferry to Oban and on the horizon the Small Isles, the first community buyout in Egg, bunkhouses in Rum, community support in Rassie Outdoor Centre. So much for tourism in Skye, the importance of Gaelic to the economy and our support for Solmarosgate, the new build adjoining village Kilbeg, a great example of support for creative industries, including film. We'll sail past Mull and vibrant community enterprises, Mull Bakery, whale watching, Iona Way, the support for the new Tobermory Marina and Harbour. Look to port and see the new marina and community centre at Loch Allen, and support for the Loch Allen silica mine and its glass-making product. Back at mainland Oban, the new university town, the Centre for Marine Science at Dunstaffnage, now part of the University of the Highlands and Islands, the Mull of Kintyre, wind towers, Macrahanish community that owns the huge runways and former airport. See our support for golf and tourism, Island its Whisky Trail and the new Macri Golf Hotel. Over to Butte, support for communities, boatyards, and the rebuild and renaissance of the famous Doon the Water Pavilion. Dunoon and its problems of poor employment, refurbishing of Dunoon Borough Hall, the relationship with Europe's largest contact centre network, WebHelp, which started its life in Dunoon. We can see Arran, Achrani Resort, the largest employer on the island after NHS, the Arran Tourism Network, and community support. We're now heading home through Fort William, passing the diving centre and the Hopes for Aluminium Smelter, the Nevis Range, originally a winter sports resort that now makes up over 50% of its income from mountain biking, over to Aviemore and the importance of Cairngorm Mountain to tourism in Badenoch and Strathspey, the dreaded funicular and the issues, reflect upon High's first ever National Communities Conference in 2017, held in Aviemore, which was so successful, and finally back to Inverness. So what does this story tell us? It's a reminder of the richness of Scotland, the resilience, the imagination and innovation of its people and its culture, its unique geography and natural resources contributing to the world. I call it pride. This is a quote from a former chair of High, Sir Fraser Morrison, with which I hope you agree. I would probably go further and say that High has been a transformational catalyst for the economy of the region and the well-being of its communities. The geographical structure of High, its outward-facing collegiate culture, linked to its natural inherent values, and the role of the board, I would suggest to you, a fundamental building block of success. I now want to briefly talk about politics and its challenges. I, together with many others of our stakeholders, were able on High's 50th anniversary in 2015 to laud the many achievements since its creation as a tool to resolve the Highland problem. It therefore came as a huge shock in 2017 as a consequence of Scottish Government's Enterprise and Skills Review that it was proposed that a strategy be pursued of integrating the agencies subject to the review, High, Scottish Enterprise, Skills Development Scotland, and the Scottish Funding Council. This would remove the board of all four agencies and replace them with a single board. I confess it was a nightmare time, as I strongly believed that the disappearance of High and its board would damage and weaken the opportunities for the region's economy and thereby Scotland. I had a difficult choice to make. As a ministerial appointment, I had limited options. I either resigned in a very public protest or fight the cause from within the tent. I did the latter, meeting with MPs, MSPs, ministers, local authorities, chief executives and political leaders, stakeholders and voices of influence. However, much more importantly and separately, strong voices with media support from across the region railed against the proposals for the removal of the Board of High and therefore the individual status of the organisation. Getting rid of the Board of High slowly but surely became an unpalatable political option. A different solution to the problems identified by the Enterprise and Skills Review had to be found. I absolutely understood the issue, that in a small country of our size, how could we get more bang for our buck by way of output from those four agencies, and as an underpinning consequence, improve Scotland's productivity? After all, the agencies took up almost 30% of the spend of Scotland's budget. And you might think with some legitimacy that a single agency for Scotland incorporating economic development, skills planning, and education made absolute sense. The answer of the review was, in essence, to put all the agencies together under one umbrella body. And therefore, it followed each agency would have to work better together. First step, get rid of the organizational barriers of structure and the individual boards. Interestingly, the opposition to removing High was not just voiced in the Highlands and Islands, but also in other parts of the rest of Scotland. I was asked by Scottish ministers to come up with an alternative solution to the problems raised by the Enterprise and Skills Review, and to do so in just under 8 weeks, so to be in time for the next major parliamentary debate on the issue. It was a very, very hot political topic. It was a very odd situation, as I was given no steer or direction, although I took comfort that in asking me to formulate a solution, it must follow that ministers knew the demise of High was not an option. I was to consult with the chairs of the other three agencies and seek the views of key stakeholders as to how to achieve the desired outcome of the strategic review, namely better collaboration and better collective performance of the Enterprise and Skills agencies. It's a long story of an intense 8 weeks, including engagement with large forums of stakeholders, but consensus of all four chairs proved impossible, principally because I would not accept the integration of High into Scottish Enterprise or some other larger agency of government, because it would not be to the benefit of the Highlands and Islands and consequently Scotland. My proposals for the reconstruction of how these agencies should work, together with the creation of what was called and is the National Strategic Board, to coordinate and hold these agencies to account for their collaborative performance, were adopted without alteration by ministers and passed through the parliamentary debate with a very positive vote of confidence from all political parties. I'm pleased to say that there were positive outcomes from this difficult experience, namely, High survived in unchanged form. The success of High and the reasons for its success were acknowledged. A new and better accountability model for this significant part of Scottish Government was created, the Strategic Board, and South of Scotland Enterprise, the new economic development agency for the Borders and Dumfries and Galloway regions, was created in the absolute mirror image of High, including its purpose, its remit, and its powers. Very briefly, I'd like to mention digital connectivity and why it's so crucially important to the Highlands and Islands, as well as other rural economies in Scotland. Scotland is sparsely populated, and the competitiveness of its rural economy, including the Highlands and Islands, has been significantly affected by issues of lack of good digital connectivity as a result of market failure, underpinned by the understandable rationale that the cost of the infrastructure did not match the likely future return for broadband service providers. High was asked to lead the Digital Scotland Superfast Broadband project for the Highlands and Islands, with Scottish Government funding of £146 million. Between 2014 and 2020, fibre optic cables were laid across seabeds to our islands, and you will likely have been delayed for some time in the Highlands by open reach personnel digging up roads to lay fibre optic cable. The consequences of High's intervention with Scottish Government support was transformational for the economy. Now there was access to fibre optic broadband at any speed, increased from 4% to 93% of premises and homes in the region. Access to superfast broadband, that's over 30 megabits per second, was 83%. A contract called R100, reaching 100%, is ongoing, and the contract for the Highlands and Islands is worth £384 million. Digital connectivity can and is transforming the opportunities for rural Scotland, and much more can be done. I couldn't possibly omit to mention Cairngorm Mountain Resort and all its much publicised difficulties. We own the mountain and the ski resort. You will most likely have read or heard about it. Time restraints preclude me from talking about it in detail. It really is a full lecture Harvard case study. It's such a topic of interest, and I'd be happy to answer any questions and explain any issues later. I'd like to mention briefly land reform and its importance for the region. Land and who owns it has long been at the heart of Highlands and Islands Development Board and High's mission to promote economic development and opportunity in the region. As far back as 1992, High supported the Ascent Crofters Trust in its purchase of North Lochinver Estate. A major step change occurred following legislation in 2015, which gave communities more powers to take on land and buildings, to develop local amenities, and to have a say in how these services are delivered. A huge contributor to the progress of community-owned land is the Scottish Land Fund, which is managed by High and supports rural and urban communities to become more resilient and more sustainable through the ownership and management of land and land assets. It's a fund with a budget of £10 million per annum, and to the end of financial year 2021, had spent £39 million supporting 232 communities. Over 560,000 acres of land are now in community ownership, 97% of which are in the Highlands and Islands. You may be surprised to learn that over 75% of the Outer Hebrides is now owned by its communities. These quotes are from previous chairs as to why land ownership reform has been so important to the region. Having visited many community land ownership trusts, I was genuinely inspired by the people and the outcomes they were achieving for their communities. It is truly remarkable. We have a relatively new Scottish Land Commission, which was established in 2016 with the defined purpose to drive a programme of land reform spanning both urban and rural land to create a Scotland where land is owned and used in ways that are fair, that are responsible, and that are productive. I so hope it fulfills its aspirations. In 2018, I was asked to speak at the World Community Development Conference in Edinburgh. It's a global gathering to share community development practice in different countries. It was with great pride I learned that community development models of High were being adopted and plagiarized in many other countries around the globe. There was huge admiration for Scotland's community economic development model linked to community land ownership. I know that community land reform based upon the Scottish model is in active consideration in some other jurisdictions, including Canada, particularly Nova Scotia and Australia. In concluding, I hope I've been able to demonstrate to you that High's unique and innovative approach to economic development does bear your scrutiny, is absolute value for taxpayers' money, and that there are important lessons as to how we should approach economic and community development across Scotland. The newly created South of Scotland Enterprise is now demonstrating excellent outcomes for its region. We must find a way that the rest of Scotland benefits from focused community and business development. Scotland's rural economy makes up almost 30% of Scotland's economy and has been the principal sector for Scotland's economic growth since 2010. Our national policies should have a focus upon the rural economy. It currently doesn't. After all, the rural economy contributes the same economic output of that of Glasgow and Edinburgh combined. A report from the Auditor General in January of this year found that even now, Skills Development Scotland and the Scottish Funding Council have not been able to agree how integrated skills planning should work. So important to facilitating the right skills for economic growth. How disappointing. Collaboration must be embedded in the culture and value of the public sector in Scotland, and High is a good example to follow. High has demonstrated that the blight of the Highland problem could be solved with dedicated focus and approach. More and more young people are choosing, more and more young people in the Highlands and Islands are choosing to live, to work, and to study there. And the pandemic has further brought rural economies to the fore as a place to live. Scotland is uniquely placed in some emerging and exciting sectors, and I gave as examples marine energy and space. If we embrace the learning from our previous successes and indeed our failures through our economic and community development experiments in the Highlands and Islands, it will be a very important building block for the future prosperity of Scotland. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to me.
Thanks very much indeed, Professor Crerar. That was a tremendous spotlit gaze into the engine room of economic development there. We'll take a 5-minute break now to collect our thoughts and collect questions. Lorne has gracefully said he would accept questions on subjects a bit beyond the subject of tonight's topic, but I would like to think we would concentrate on that. So we'll take a break now and be back in about 5 minutes. Thank you. And I'd like to open up to the live audience here. First of all, do we have a question? There's a microphone on its way.
Yes, thank you very much for that excellent lecture. One of your earliest statistics on it I found quite tragic, and that was that only 5.4% of the land is owned by the communities that live and work there. And in the rest of Scotland, it was even lower. Now, what occurs to me from this, and I wonder if you agree with this and agree with a potential solution, is that the most important resource we have is land. And that for so much of it to be in the hands of just a few people who seem intent on neglecting that resource or even preventing other development like the spaceport you mentioned, would you agree that we really should be thinking about some kind of land tax that punishes this kind of neglect and is a vehicle by which the land could be come back into public ownership and then be passed to communities? Thanks.
Okay. Well, it's obviously a very highly political topic, and I confess to being on the radical side of it. In my 20s, I followed the 784 group, the theatre group, the Chievy at the Stack and the Blackback Oil. 7% of the population owned 84% of its land. So I think really what Highlands and Islands demonstrates is the benefits of community land ownership. But I think it's also fair to say that the history of land ownership in the West Highlands of Scotland is really quite different from many other parts of Scotland. It's kind of the worst example. If you think of trying to sell Barra in 1850 for a penal colony, or you've heard of Neudert or the evacuation of Skye. So it's particularly bad in terms of history. So for me, a really good statistic is the 75% of the Outer Hebrides owned by the communities. But most importantly, it's created very significant employment, enabling people to live and stay and work in the place they were brought up. So it does demonstrate how it works. I did also mention in my talk the Scottish Land Commission. Now, the Scottish Land Commission is not that old a body and was set up for the very reasons you've mentioned, to see how best that the resource of land can be used for the prosperity of Scotland. And one of the key features of that is around economic development. So at the moment, they're on the direction of Scottish Government, they're coming up with a whole lot of different things about how land reform could take place. But it is going to take some time, but at least it's there and it's thinking about it. And if you go onto their website, it's really very interesting of what they're looking at, including tax reform on matters of large swathes of land. So there is something happening.
Can we take another question from the audience, the live audience here? Thank you, George.
Thank you. Thank you again for the lecture. It was very interesting. And it was a case study in the potential for prosperity that came about because of the Highland High. My understanding of a lot of rural development was the benefits that came from European funding.
Yeah.
And I wondered whether you could maybe reflect on that and what the challenges are going forward to agencies similar to High post-Brexit.
What a good question. The Highlands and Islands, I used the word fragile a couple of times in my presentation. And the Highlands and Islands was designated under European protocols as being a fragile area in need of support. So the Highlands and Islands, the region, benefited very, very significantly from matched European funds. And quite a lot of the projects I mentioned to you, while High had invested in them, they had matched funding from Europe. So that world has now ended, and the interest is how Westminster government seeks to replace or replicate, if at all, the benefits that existed for fragile and remote communities. But I suppose on the positive, We had a very good experience for quite a long time and made a lot of progress, but it's very disappointing we don't have that availability and match funding. I did mention that Wave Energy Scotland had a €20 million support with a Basque company, and that was a European fund, and that was on a purely commercial basis. They recognised the world-leading expertise of Wave Energy Scotland and have a joint project around wave energy, just based on them being the best in the world to help them with the final technology for wave.
Could we bring in a question from the virtual audience, please?
Okay, well, the first one is a comment rather than a question, but Robert Gibson is reminiscing that he used to work in the old HIDB, and he tells us that the library of the HIDB was supposed to be the basis of the Highlands University. First question we've got here, if you had 3 wishes for improvement, 1 each for the ferry, the rail and bus services for the Highlands and Islands, what would they be?
3 wishes for transport communication in the Highlands.
The question has asked 1 for the ferry, 1 for the rail and 1 for buses.
Which would I choose?
Well, I think 1 of each, I think, is the intention.
Well, the ferries at the moment, as you know, are the subject of much public debate, and the recent report of Audit Scotland and the failures around CalMac and the provision of ferry services. I don't think it can be underestimated the damage that does to the economy of the Highlands and Islands. So if I had to pick between the 3, I would say, can we please sort that one first? The railways are going into a new world, as we know, with Scottish Rail Holdings, and we should have great hopes for the difference that will make as they've taken back the franchise. But if you went to Fort William or to Argyll, they would say, can you please fix I think it's the A82, Loch Lomond's, and the rest be thankful. And actually, it is a real inhibitor to economic opportunity.
We're taking another one from the virtual audience. Can I just ask, is the sound quality okay, or do we need to, will we be picking that up okay? Thank you.
The North Coast 500 is perhaps currently too successful, since parts of it seem unable to cope with the number of visitors, especially those driving motorhomes. What is the solution?
Well, what is the solution? Well, in Gairloch, where we are, we really want to see a solution because it's a great economic driver, excuse the pun. It's bringing so many people to the Highlands and Islands, particularly during the pandemic, where people haven't had the option of going abroad. The problem with it is the facilities that support motorhomes in the Highland area. And so in High Part, we have supported several communities in providing facilities for motorhomes and discharge of their grey water, etc. So some communities are having the benefit of doing that, but the responsibility falls with the Highland Council in terms of how they start to provide some sort of services support, which is desperately needed. So it is a product, I suppose, of its own success. My understanding is that it's kind of followed the example of Route 66 in the US. And what we are going to see, they say, is that you have an initial huge peak, and then it will temper off, and we'll have a much more, a slower flow, if you like. But I don't have the answer. People have talked of tolls on the bridge or tolls for motorhomes. Hopefully something happens, because it needs to be done. And in some communities, my own in Gairloch, they would say that many motorhomes don't bring much apart from waste. And there's something needs to be seriously thought about what we do. Sure. Sure.
And it's not just the remote. Just take this because it's relevant.
Okay, I admit that we're motorhome owners, so therefore biased, but we do have some expertise in this area at ODS. The truth is that motorhomes bring their own facilities. If you consider the people in the motorhome, what happens when nature calls, compared with the owners of cars, well, they end up doing things outside the car, and I ask you to decide which is the most destructive to the environment, because there's no way Highland Region can provide all the toilet facilities that are currently needed. And the truth is that a motorhome actually comes with all its facilities, but the people in them still eat in the restaurants, so they still spend money. The only thing they don't spend is in the hotels. They also provide traffic calming, because the real problem in the Northern 500 are people hiring convoys of sports cars and driving dangerously. So in actual fact, if you really analyse it, motorhomes are not the problem.
Is there a question from the audience on any other aspect of Mr. Crear's experience that he offered to answer on?
I can hear you fine, yes.
Okay, can you hear me now? Testing, testing. Okay, I'm a geologist by training, and I've travelled a bit of the Highlands, Scourie, and the West Coast. But I'm kind of looking at the impacts that we're going through at the moment, the world changing order. And you see, like at 2030, can you kind of visualize a changed, transformational impacts to not just Scotland, but the Highlands?
I didn't catch the first bit of the question, did you?
Well, I'm talking about a transformation. I'm talking about we're having electric cars, we're having an oil and gas industry that's declining.
Maybe not use that. That's actually what making it worse. You can just maybe speak, just talk, and I'll catch that. Yeah. Well, we're in 2022, and I see a huge. I would do. But I do see a huge opportunity for the Highlands and Islands post-pandemic. We know of the gravitation to living rurally. I know in my own experience, working from my business remotely in Gairloch, I know it can be done, and many others are doing the same. At one end of the spectrum, what we're seeing is that significantly more, there is a young person survey you can get on the High website, where it's a remarkable statistic. It goes like that. The number of young people that see their future home in the Highlands is going through the roof. And that's because of, number one, connectivity. And I was asked about transport connectivity, and that's important, but digital connectivity is equally important. And the second most important factor are jobs with opportunities of advancement. And for the rural economy, I think there are huge opportunities, and in particular, the Highlands and Islands. I was co-chair of the Council of Rural Advisors, Scottish Government, which came up with a rural economy strategy, which I mentioned briefly about, we need to do something about it. So I see, if I was investing my money now, I would invest it in the Highlands and Islands. The green energy opportunities, the marine opportunities, the blue economy, if we grab it with both hands, I see it as being a huge opportunity for Scotland. So in 2030, I would expect we've made significant progress. The population estimates for Murrayshire for 2040 is the population will be 8.4% higher than it is now. For the rest of the Highland, it's only 2%. But that being said, for the rest of Scotland, it's predicted to fall. So I see the Highlands and Islands as really being a place of opportunity. And if I had my time again, that's where I would go. Yes, yes, I do.
Thanks for the question. Have we taken another question from the audience at home?
Okay, we've had lots of questions on renewable energy and energy transformation. It's been known for, I'm trying to summarize a few questions here, but it's been known for decades that we've got the resource there. There's been efforts to create prototypes and generate an industry. The wind industry is really Danish and Spanish at the moment. Why has it taken so long? And are you optimistic that this time we can go beyond prototypes?
Why has it taken so long? Well, I don't know why it's taken so long, but what I was trying to explain in my talk was that in terms of tidal stream, in terms of wind, in terms of wave, we have this absolutely phenomenal opportunity. And Wave Energy Scotland, I tried to explain that it's at the cusp of breaking that technology. So just by our geography, and at last one might say, all that wind we've endured, all that rain we've endured, at last we're going to be able to harness it. And actually, the expertise is in the Highlands. If you think of Atlantic Maygen and it's like wind turbines on the seafloor in the Pentland Firth with 12 knots of tide going one way for 6 hours, then 12 knots the other way. Just think of the force of nature. And if we can capture that, what an opportunity. And we are very close. Why is it taking so long? I don't know. Should we grasp it with both hands and make sure we do? The risk is that we lose our expertise. It's like EMEC. It's been, other countries now want to understand what's the intellectual property we've got. The Wave Energy project is about maintaining our intellectual property. We've been involved in many other countries, so I think we're almost there.
Thanks for your talk. You said that rural economy accounts for 30%. 27% of Scottish output, a much smaller percentage of the population. Yep. So there are two questions that come out from that for me. One is, how much of that is due to the loss of economy in the central belt? And the other is, what lessons does the rest of Scotland need to take to match what's happened in the Highlands and Islands?
Again, that's a very good question, because I think from memory, the rural economy is 27 to 30%. Now, the 50% of rural businesses are not that registered. So they're not caught in the data. So the rural economy is probably a lot more as a percentage of Scotland's output than we know, because there are so many businesses. And one of the slides I think I showed you when I was talking was saying the size of the average. There are many more businesses per capita in the rural economy than the urban economy, predictably. The size of the businesses are significantly smaller, with significantly smaller, accordingly, number of employees. But it does make up 27% of our economy. And the other factor is, as I understand it, for the headquartered whiskey businesses, their statistics are in the urban economy because their HQs are in Glasgow or Edinburgh. They're not in the Highlands. So the rural economy is a very significant contributor. And I was co-chair of the, as I mentioned, the Council of Rural Advisors. That was set up because of the concerns around the removal of the Common Agricultural Policy and its subsidies. And it was thought, everyone thought, well, we must just replace that in some way. And I showed everyone the video of High saying, no, it's not just about arable. It's not just about fishing. It's not just about forestry. This is what the rural economy can be like. It can be integrated and different and productive and give opportunities out with these industries. So actually, I think we've got it the wrong way around. I think the real opportunities are in rural Scotland and the worry is urban Scotland. And I was at a conference where it was a bit of a light bulb moment for me, because we're all talking about what should we do about the rural economy. And this guy, this very persuasive speaker said, you have got it the wrong way around. The rural economy is going to be great. Look at all the things that are happening. And I've tried to describe lots of them. The real worry is urban decay. So part of the challenge for Scotland is, and one of the slides I gave you was, I think, Melness Community Centre. that said it was now down to 16 pupils. Gairloch has the lowest headcount of secondary pupils it's ever had. You know, so we have room, we have opportunity. So I think your point's absolutely right. So it's how do we learn the lessons and that actually foster growth in rural Scotland with all the benefits that has. And the migration will no longer be to urban centres. It will be the other way around.
But how do you see the current policies facilitating that?
Well, I think the current policies, well, in terms of the overall structure, Scottish Government's created the South of Scotland Enterprise Agency. Now, it's a small agency, but that makes sense to me, and it's making a huge difference. And my question in my talk was, well, actually, what happened was Dumfries and Galloway in the borders. There's a political difference, obviously. You can think of it, but they were saying we want a high. You know, look what they've done. Why can't we do it? Recognizing the size of their businesses were broadly the same as ours. They had the same kind of geographical distance problems and internet problems, broadband problems. So it is starting to work. So my challenge in my talk was to say, how do we make sure the rest of Scotland gets the benefit of it? And I think part of that's about having an integrated rural policy, which I understand Scottish Government are working on. But I do think it's a different focus and it's a different opportunity. Hope that answers your question. Sort of.
Do we have something else from the outside audience? Thanks very much.
A questioner asks whether they would be right in guessing that the government's aim in asking High to join with Scottish Enterprise was for the latter to learn from your experience rather than vice versa.
No, it wasn't. I think it's, I posed the question in my talk. I think it's a very understandable argument that you should have one agency for skills and education and economic development. It's a very compelling argument. But my argument was you need to be moving into a higher denominator rather than a lower one. And I don't mean that unkindly, but that's really what I felt. And I think the challenge, I think back then with the Enterprise and Skills Review, it was genuinely seen that if you needed to make everyone work better together, and I did say in my talk that I'm very surprised how poor collaboration is in the public sector. It needs to change. And the kind of sledgehammer was get rid of all the structures, stick everyone together, and it's bound to work better. No, it's not. Is the answer to that. But I think there are real lessons from it and that we need to really think about how we do it all better and how we collaborate in a way that, because collaboration, you're always going to do better working together than trying to solve the problem on your own, seems to me. Okay.
Another question from the audience.
Thank you very much for your very enjoyable tour around Scotland. I had the good fortune about 2 decades ago of working for and doing a consultancy job for both Shetland Islands and for High. And I think the problem I see with joining up the agencies is exactly the same problem as we currently have with Police Scotland. We had forces which worked across many regions and they worked well. Then we had Police Scotland, and it's a shambles. And I think you're correct in insisting that we don't go down a single body to do things. I also was connected in a small way with the WAVE projects, and it is interesting to note that the only really successful use of tidal applications at the moment is up in Unst, where they can power their cars from the tidal wave. Exactly the same as it moving through the Pentland, moves between Unst and the mainland in Shetland. And again, the big problem, Shetland recognised that as an island, simply putting it, covering it in wind turbines is no use if you can't sell your electricity anywhere? And well, how do you solve the problem of selling the energy that we can make in the islands if we have nowhere to sell it to? Where to sell it to?
Well, yeah, the Viking project, I think that's Shetland. There is a new interconnector from the Shetland Islands and Orkney to the mainland for the very purpose of being able to export its energy. So that has been recognised, and that energy is being exported from the Highlands to the rest of the United Kingdom through the national grid. And the national grid has also been extended out into the Western Highlands to enable the projects there, mostly hydro and wind, to produce energy for the national grid. So that is happening. I was in Unst, and I asked a community group why they didn't want the bridge that was being proposed. And they said, well, that would make it far too easy for the young people to leave the island in some ways. So it's just different, but it's a different opportunity.
Just got time for one quick question from the virtual audience.
I don't know if this will be a quick one, but you've worked on standards and ethics. You referred to the Nolan principles. Is there any hope of bringing back decency and standards to UK politics?
Well, the Nolan principles, we all know, and are integral to public service, and the Nolan principles are applied across the whole of the UK. I don't know, but it's certainly worked here and does work here in relation to our public sector and our elected politicians. It's certainly there and is used.
Sneak one more in. Last question.
Thank you. There's one big fat elephant in the room. How will independence affect the Highlands? Is it good or bad for that area?
Again, I didn't catch that.
I'll just speak louder. Something that hasn't been discussed is independence. Would an independent Scotland be good for the Highlands and Islands or bad for the Highlands and Islands?
I don't know, and I haven't considered it, but I can say that under the current regime, if you work out the maths, I think Scottish Enterprise funding is around 300 million. We do get a bit more support per capita than the rest of Scotland. So what independence would do for that, I don't know.
You say you haven't considered it, but you were chairman of the HIE.
Yes, but being chairman of HIE is a government appointment. You do as you are told by the government of the time, whatever its political makeup, be it a party that wants independence or not. It's nothing to do with my own politics about what I think is a good thing for Scotland. So you work for the then caucus of ministers. And during my time in High, all of my ministers were, I thought, excellent, and they were all of the current SNP government. Okay. I just say thanks to the questions.
Thanks very much indeed for all the questions. And I'd just like to bring this part of the meeting to a close by thanking Professor Crerar for an absolutely fascinating insight into the real workings of aspects of the Scottish economy that we would probably not hear so much about through the normal means. So thanks once again very much on behalf of the Society.